Under the glass, the metal lay face up on a bed of faded velvet, gone the color of an old bruise, its ribbon slack, its star catching the fluorescent tube overhead in a small, cold wink. Why would an old farmer pawn a stranger's war medal? And why does he flinch when the shop owner reads the engraved name aloud? No hand had touched it in the 11 minutes since it had been logged, tagged, and set beneath the counterlight to wait its turn, and in that stillness, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to be, a dead man's decoration, priced by a living man's guess. Dalton Westbrook had the phone wedged against his shoulder, running numbers with a buyer in Springfield about a set of trench knives, and he had that particular half-attention of a man conducting two transactions at once, one with his mouth and one with his eyes. His eyes were on Wilbur Dabney, who stood at the far end of the counter in a barn coat the color of creek clay, both hands resting flat and easy on the glass, like a man waiting on a diagnosis he already expected. "Yeah, hold on," Westbrook said into the phone, then covered the mouthpiece with two fingers and leaned toward Simone Gaines, who was cataloging a box of fishing reels behind the register. He didn't bother lowering his voice. "Watch this one. Guarantee you he found it in a shoebox at some estate sale for $1, and now he's hoping nobody around here reads fine print." A man near the gun case laughed, short and easy, the kind of laugh that costs nothing. Simone didn't laugh. She looked instead at the old man's hands, which hadn't moved, and at the set of his shoulders, one of which sat lower than the other, canted forward as if perpetually bracing to turn rather than reach. Wilbur said nothing. He had heard some version of that sentence in 11 other shops, in 11 other towns, over more years than he cared to count aloud, and he had learned there was no profit in answering an insult before it had finished proving itself wrong. If you've ever underestimated the quiet ones carrying more than they let on, you already know how this ends. What nobody in that room could yet imagine, not Westbrook, not the laughing man by the gun case, not even Simone, who had only worked the counter a year and had not yet learned to read a silence the way she would learn to by sundown, was that in 72 hours a regional auction catalog would go to press with a dead man's name stamped beneath a photograph of that very metal, and that the name was wrong, and that only the stooped old farmer standing at the counter, waiting to be underestimated one more time, held the one piece of proof left on earth that could stop it. 3 days, one filed rim beneath a maker's mark, and a name that had waited 55 years to be spoken correctly out loud. The coat was the first thing anyone noticed, and the last thing anyone understood. It hung on Wilbur Dabney the way old barnwood hangs on a fence line, weathered into a color no die chart had ever named on purpose, buttoned wrong at the collar so that the top button sat askew over a shirt pressed sharp enough to shave by. Underneath the coat, his frame had the economy of a man who had long ago stopped wasting motion. He did not reach for things so much as turn his whole body toward them, feeding his right shoulder forward like a door swinging on a hinge that would rise only so far before it stopped. Chest height, no further, no matter what waited above it. He set the metal case on the counter using both hands together, the way a man sets down something with a level in it, and he did not let go until it had settled flat. 60 years old, easy, Westbrook said to no one in particular, finishing his other call, sliding his phone into his shirt pocket with the satisfaction of a man closing one ledger to open another. "Where'd you come up with it?" "Bought it," Wilbur said. "Long time back." "From who?" "A man who needed the money worse than he needed the metal." Wilbur's voice carried no defense in it, no plea, just the flat cadence of a fact being read off a label. "Same as most of them." Westbrook glanced at Simone, one eyebrow up, an unspoken C. She didn't return the look. She had already noticed the way the old man's left hand rested on the counter's edge while his right stayed folded against his stomach, and the way his eyes went not to Westbrook's face, but past him, to the window, gauging the light the way a man gauges weather before deciding whether to cut hay. "Miss," Wilbur said, and it was the first time he'd spoken to her directly, "before anything gets logged, I'd take it kindly if you'd write down the name off the front of it, just the name. However you've got it filed." Simone blinked. "The name that's already engraved on it?" Yes, ma'am, before the transaction closes, not after." He said it plainly, without weight, the way a man might ask for a receipt. "I found it saves trouble later." She wrote it down without being told twice. the pen scratching across an intake slip in handwriting still young enough to loop its capital letters. It was a small thing, the kind of request a customer makes and a clerk forgets by lunch, and she nearly did forget it, except that something in the plainness of his asking snagged at her the way a nail snags a sleeve. Not painful, just impossible to walk past without noticing. It was the 12th time he had asked a version of that question at a counter like this one. He did not tell her that. He had learned, across more towns than most men see in a lifetime, that a story offered before it is asked for sounds like an excuse, and an excuse is the fastest way to be disbelieved. So he offered nothing. He only waited. The weight of his body settled evenly on both feet in the particular stillness of a man who has done a great deal of standing in his life and has made his peace with it. Westbrook lifted the medal from its case by the ribbon, held it a moment at arm's length like a man weighing a fish before deciding whether to keep it, and read the engraved name off the reverse rim, the way a clerk reads out a serial number without ceremony. Wilbur's jaw did not move, but something behind his eyes went very still in a different register than the rest of him, the stillness of a man watching a name spoken correctly and yet entirely wrong, a discrepancy no one in the room could yet hear. "That'll do it," Westbrook said, setting the medal down. "We'll get you a number here shortly." He reached under the counter and produced a laminated sheet, its corners soft and rounded from years of handling, 3 columns of small block text arranged like a catechism. He held it the way another man might hold a hymn book, thumb marking a line he already knew by heart. Silver star, correct era casting, ribbon shows honest wear, no reproduction tooling on the star points. He ran his finger down the sheet as he spoke, checking boxes that existed only in his memory, the laminate itself blank of ink. Engraving matches period stamping practice. Provenance is soft. You don't have paperwork, you said? No paperwork, Wilbur said. Then that's fine. That's common, especially with these older estate pieces. We work off condition and market comparables in that case. Westbrook said it kindly enough, the practiced kindness of a man delivering bad news wrapped in procedure. Given the soft provenance, I can do 240 as a purchase or a consignment listing at auction value minus commission, which given the current militaria market is running strong on named silver stars, could see it clear 4 figures. Your call. The name's wrong, Wilbur said. Westbrook's finger paused on the laminate. Wrong how? Wrong man. Never held that decoration in his life. Wilbur said it the way another man might report the weather. No heat in it at all. He was a good soldier, just not this one. Sir, the engraving is original to the piece. That's not a line item that gets disputed. That's the manufacturer's stamp process. I didn't say the stamping was fake. Wilbur's hand came up, not sharply, just enough to mark a boundary. I said the name's wrong. Westbrook exhaled through his nose, the particular patience of a young man who believes patience itself is a kind of proof. I'll do 260 as a courtesy, given you're clearly attached to the piece. He said courtesy like a coin he was flipping onto the counter, generous and final at once. It was Simone who leaned in then, not to argue but to look, turning the medal gently on its ribbon under the counterlight, the way she'd turn a jar to read a label. Oh. The reverse rim, just beneath the maker's mark, carried a second run of numbers, finer than the manufacturer's own stamping, cut at a shallower angle, as if by a different tool entirely. Dalton, she said quietly. There's no line for this on the sheet. He glanced down without really looking. The way a man glances at something he has already decided does not require his attention. Wear marks. Happens to old silver. He folded the laminate back along its crease. 260 stands. That's a fair number for an unverified piece, old-timer, and I'd take it before the market on these cools off. Wilbur said nothing to that either. He only reached out, unhurried, and turned the medal a half-inch further toward the window, toward a light Westbrook had not yet thought to use. The afternoon rush came the way it always did at Westbrook & Sons, in waves rather than a tide. A woman pawning a guitar for grocery money, 2 boys arguing over a hunting knife's edge, a retired mill foreman named Purdy who came in most Tuesdays just to talk and rarely bought anything at all. Wilbur stood through all of it at the end of the counter, unmoving, the metal case within arm's reach, patient in the particular way of a man who has waited on weather, on harvests, on decisions made by other men in rooms he wasn't allowed into. "You still here?" Westbrook said at one point, not unkindly so much as absently, the way a man notes a fence post he's walked past all his life. "I am." 260's still the number. "I heard you the first time." A man by the gun case, one of the regulars, laughed at that, a short bark of a thing. "He's going to stand there till you cave, Dalton. My money's on the old man." Westbrook smiled the smile of a man confident enough to be amused by his own confidence. "The market doesn't care how long a fellow stands at a counter," he said, mostly for the room's benefit. "Feelings don't move numbers. Comparables move numbers." "Citation type matters more than comparables," Wilbur said, not raising his voice at all, so that the room had to quiet itself to catch it. Silver Star citations from that era read different depending on whether the action was infantry-led or artillery-supported. "You'll want to check which this one says, because the wording doesn't match a man who served in a rear logistics company, which is what your engraved names unit was." Westbrook's mouth opened, then closed. "You know his unit." "I know a great many units," Wilbur said. 4th Infantry ran 3 separate companies through that valley in the same 18 months. Easy enough to mix a name to a medal if nobody's checking dates against deployment rosters. The laughing man had gone quiet somewhere in the middle of that, the particular quiet of someone recalculating a bet he'd made for entertainment, and was starting to suspect had been serious all along. Purdy, the mill foreman, leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, watching now with the stillness of a man at a card table who has just noticed another player counting cards in his head rather than on the table. Wilbur reached out, slow, deliberate, and lifted the medal from its case himself for the first time, turning his whole body rather than his wrist to angle it, the frozen shoulder swinging him around like a gate on a hinge. He held it up not toward the counter lamp Westbrook favored, but toward the front window, where the afternoon sun came in low and flat across Marsh Crossing's main street. "Your light in here's good for showing a shine," Wilbur said. "It's no good for showing a file mark. You want the low sun for that. Always have." Westbrook came around the counter despite himself, drawn the way a man is drawn to a card being turned over slow. He looked where Wilbur was looking, at the rim beneath the maker's stamp, where the window light raked sideways across a second, shallower groove that the countertop bulb had washed flat and invisible for the better part of an hour. "That's not where," Westbrook said, and for the first time his voice had lost its rehearsed ease. "No," Wilbur agreed. "It surely is not." The room had gone quiet enough by then that the ceiling fan's small creak was audible, turning lazy circles over a silence that had not existed 20 minutes before. Wilbur turned the medal fully over, laid it flat against his open palm, and tilted it once more so the window light fell dead across the rim beneath the manufacturer's stamp. There, cut shallow and deliberate, sat a second run of digits, finer than any factory tool would leave, spaced with the particular unevenness of a hand working a punch by eye rather than by jig. "My ordnance sergeant cut a mark like this into every metal our company processed," Wilbur said. 57 years back. Wasn't Army policy, wasn't anybody's policy. He did it on his own because he didn't trust the paperwork even then, and it turned out he had the right instinct because the paperwork burned in a fire 4 years later and took half our unit's citations with it. Westbrook leaned in, closer than he had let himself get all afternoon. "That's a serial. That's an actual serial, not damage." "It is. And it doesn't match the engraved name." "No," Wilbur said. "It doesn't." Simone had gone very still behind the counter, pen forgotten in her hand, watching the old man's blunt, unhurried finger trace the second number, the way another man might trace a line in scripture he'd read 1,000 times and still needed to touch to believe. "Whose number is it then?" Westbrook asked, and his voice had dropped the practiced ease entirely now, gone plain, almost young. Wilbur didn't answer right away. He set the medal down flat on the counter, turned his whole body square to it the way he turned to everything, and for a moment the shop held its breath around him, the fan ticking its slow circle, Purdy gone silent by the gun case, the mother with the guitar pausing halfway to the door to watch. "Mine," Wilbur said. One word, plain as a nail driven true, and it landed in that room the way a dropped tool lands on a concrete floor, sudden, final, echoing longer than its size would suggest. The name on the front was never the name the Army meant to honor, he said into the silence that followed. It got put there by a clerk copying off a roster that had 2 men's information transposed the same week our unit ran through processing. Happens more than folks like to think when a whole company comes through discharge at once. The medal you've got listed under a stranger's name was cut and struck for me. I've known it 55 years. Nobody else left alive can say so but one man, and I haven't found him yet to ask. Westbrook stood with the laminated checklist still in his hand, forgotten now, its edges soft from years of use and suddenly useless against a discrepancy it had never once been written to catch. Westbrook set the laminate down on the counter, slow, as though it had gotten heavier in his hand. Even if that's true, he said, and there was no scorn left in it now, only the flat unease of a man watching his own ledger tilt. I've already got this piece cataloged, engraved name, provisional attribution, photographed both sides. It's going to print with the regional auction house in 3 days. Once that catalog's bound, that attribution is the historical record. Collectors cite catalog entries for generations. Museums do too. Then unlist it, Wilbur said. I don't own it outright yet. I'm consigning it, which means the family that pawned it has a say in whether it comes off the docket, and they signed off on the listing themselves. Westbrook rubbed a hand over his jaw. And they're due here inside the hour. I called them this morning to confirm details for the print run. The bell over the front door gave its small brass complaint before he'd finished the sentence, and a woman in her 50s came through it with 2 younger men behind her, one of them still holding a folded printout of the catalog proof, the medal's photograph clear and glossy under a stranger's engraved name. Mr. Westbrook, the woman said, her voice already thinning at the edges. We wanted to see it once more before it goes to print. It was my grandfather's. It's the only thing of his we've got left that proves what he was. She said it the way people say things they have built a house on, without knowing the foundation had been laid by another man's mistake decades before she was born, and Wilbur, standing at the end of the counter in his crooked buttoned coat, felt the full weight of what correcting the record was going to cost people who had done nothing but inherit a story in good faith. Simone found the engraved soldier's service file, 3 phone calls, and 40 minutes later, borrowing a state archives contact her uncle had used for a genealogy hobby, and read the dates back to Westbrook in a voice gone careful and quiet. He shipped for training in the spring, she said, and he died of pneumonia at a stateside hospital that same October. Never left the country, never saw a unit deploy. She set the printout down on the counter like something fragile. He couldn't have earned a combat citation. He wasn't there. Westbrook read it twice himself, as if a third reading might change the dates, then looked at the family's grandson still holding his glossy proof sheet, and for the first time all afternoon, his laminated certainty had nothing at all to stand on. Then whose valor is this catalog selling? He said, mostly to himself, and no one in the shop had an answer ready, until the bell over the door rang again, and a broad-shouldered man in a gray wool coat stepped through it, moving with the unhurried authority of someone who had spent 40 years being the last person to enter a room. I'm looking for Wilbur Dabney, the man said, and his eyes found the old farmer at the end of the counter before anyone told him where to look. Somebody finally called me back. Nolan Havermeyer crossed the shop floor in 6 unhurried strides, and every step of it drew the room's attention, the way a held breath draws a chest. Purdy straightening off the gun case, the grandson lowering his printout, Simone setting down her phone without seeming to notice she'd done it. He stopped in front of Wilbur and did not offer his hand right away. Instead, he reached into his coat, drew out a folded manila sleeve, gone soft at the crease from decades of being carried and refiled and carried again, and set it on the counter between them with both hands, the way a man sets down something he has protected longer than he has protected most things in his life. I signed this in 1968, Havermeyer said. Recommendation for a Silver Star, infantry action, name of the soldier typed clear as day at the top. I've kept my own copy in a box since the day I mailed the original up the chain, because even back then something told me not to trust it to only exist in one place. He tapped the folder once, lightly, with 2 fingers. I've spent 6 years since my own retirement trying to find out why that citation was never issued under the name I typed on it. Every door I knocked on told me the file burned in '71, and there was nothing left to prove. He looked at Wilbur then, really looked, The way a man looks at a photograph he has carried so long he has stopped seeing it clearly, until suddenly he does. There was one thing left, Havermeyer said. I just didn't know he was still walking around Marsh Crossing. Wilbur reached for the folder with his good hand, turning his whole body toward it the way he turned toward everything, and opened it slow. The paper inside gone the color of weak tea, his own name typed plain across the top in a font 40-year-old typewriters no longer made. The room did not laugh now. It did not speak at all. Even the ceiling fan's small creak seemed to have gone quiet around them, though it had not, could not. And the silence in that shop was the loudest thing Simone Gaines had heard since she'd started working there a year before. You want to know why I've bought back 11 medals before this one? Wilbur said finally, and it was more words strung together at once than anyone in that shop had heard him speak all afternoon. None of them were mine either. A man's medal gets pawned by a widow who needs the money, or a son who doesn't know what he's holding, and it lands on a counter like this one, under whatever name got stamped or copied wrong at the time. And once it sells, that wrong name is the only truth left standing. Nobody left alive to argue it. So I've gone counter to counter, county to county, since the year I came home for good, buying back what I could afford and asking clerks to write down a name before the sale closed, so that if it turned out wrong, there'd at least be a record of what it said before I touched it. He set his hand flat on the open folder, not gripping it, just resting there the way a man rests his hand on a fence rail he built himself. My wife kept a ledger, he said. Household accounts mostly, but she started writing down every name I came home talking about, every county I drove to on a Saturday, without ever asking me why. Because Harriet wasn't the asking kind. She just kept the number of it, same as she kept the number of eggs the hens laid. 11 years she's been gone now, and I still add to that ledger like she's going to check it Sunday. His voice didn't crack. It simply slowed, the way a wheel slows going uphill. She never knew what she was keeping account of. I never told her outright, but she kept it anyway, faithful, same as she kept everything. He didn't come back for the medal. He came back to buy time for the man who couldn't. I didn't come here for money, Wilbur said, and for once, the plainness of it carried the whole weight of everything underneath. I came here because a family 2 counties over sold this off not knowing what it was, and somewhere down the line, another family's going to inherit a lie printed nice in an auction catalog, cited for 50 years by folks who never thought to check a rim under low light. I've got no complaint against any man in this room. I've just got a name that's waited longer than it should have to be said correctly. Havermeyer nodded slowly, and did not need to say the word honor, because he had already said everything that mattered by carrying that folder for 6 years, and finding it still true. Dalton Westbrook pulled the item from the print run himself, 3 hours before the auction house's deadline, standing at his own back office computer, while the family who had pawned the medal sat in folding chairs near the counter, listening to General Havermeyer explain, in the plain, unhurried language of a man used to briefing rooms full of worried people, exactly what a record center fire in 1971 had cost an entire company of soldiers, and how one of them had spent 55 years quietly trying to undo it, one medal at a time. The catalog entry, when it finally printed 2 days later, ran with both names side by side and a corrected provenance line explaining the second serial number and what it meant, and Westbrook wrote the copy himself, slower than he'd written anything in years, checking each word against the folder Havermeyer left him a copy of before he'd let it go to press. The market doesn't lie, he said to Simone that evening, closing up, but it turns out it only knows what somebody bothers to tell it. He didn't say it like a man defending himself. He said it like a man revising a sentence he'd believed too long, and from that week forward, the laminated checklist got a new line added to it in his own handwriting, one about checking reverse rims under raking light before assigning any provenance at all, a small correction that would outlast the catalog print by years. The family took the corrected medal home with a second card explaining who it had truly been struck for, and asked, before they left, whether Wilbur would let them shake his hand, which he did, turning his whole body toward the grandson the way he turned toward everything, unhurried, final. Months slid by the way they do on a working farm, marked more by planting and by weather than by calendar pages. And on a Sunday, no different from the second Sunday of any other month, Wilbur opened the drawer where Harriet's ledger had lived for 11 years its pages soft at the corners from a hand that wasn't hers now turning them. He added a new name beneath the last one she'd ever logged, in the same plain hand he always used, no ceremony to it, the way a man notes rainfall or the price of feed. Westbrook had asked him, before he left the shop that final time, whether he wanted the medal back outright, and Wilbur had said no. Let it sit where folks passing on the street could see it corrected, since a wrong put right where it happened teaches more than a wrong put right in private ever could. So it sat now in the front window of Westbrook & Sons, recased on fresh velvet, a single card beneath it bearing both names in even print, and beside it, propped small and plain against the glass, a torn page from a farmhouse ledger in a dead woman's handwriting joined to a living man's, listing the names still waiting to be found. Some names take 55 years to find their way back to the front of the case.